Sidebar is the official podcast of the Napa County District Attorney's Office. Hello, everyone. This is Carlos Villatoro with the Sidebar Podcast. Of course, the Sidebar Podcast is the official podcast of the Napa County District Attorney's Office. And with me today is Agnes Dziadur. She is our domestic violence DA here at the office. Now, unfortunately, domestic violence is a topic that we often see in this community as well as all over the country. And Agnes is the one who is responsible for prosecuting these cases. Isn't that right?
That is right.
So Agnes has graciously agreed to appear on the podcast to talk to us a little bit about the work she does on behalf of the people for the Napa County District Attorney's Office. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so glad that we were able to find the time out of your busy schedule to talk about this important topic.
Me too.
So Agnes, I think we're going to start out by you describing a little bit tell us about the cases that you prosecute for the District Attorney's Office.
Okay, so for the Napa County District Attorney's Office, I head up the Family Violence Unit. That includes all of the domestic violence cases as well as other cases that you might think of within the scope of family violence. That can be crimes involving sibling on sibling, a parent on a child, grandparents, aunts, uncles, those kinds of things. Really everything that falls within the scope of family violence.
And how long have you been doing this?
So currently I have been in this assignment for roughly about, I would say, 3 years. And then I have also previously done the domestic violence assignment maybe 9 or 10 years ago in my first rotation.
Mm-hmm. So who are the people that you represent? Tell us a little bit about the type of people that you see through your work here at the DA's office.
So that's an interesting question because that is a common misconception that the community has. I represent the people of the state of California for Napa County. So I don't represent the victims of crimes or anything like that. But we obviously are advocates for them. We obviously work closely with them, and they're obviously very involved in the cases that we prosecute.
Mm-hmm. So that means then, and I've seen this before as well, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on it. When somebody is a victim of domestic violence, and for example, they say they don't want to move forward with charges, and then, they are surprised, almost hurt a little bit that the district attorney's office proceeds with the charges. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So obviously we work very, very closely with victims of crime, and victims of crime are a top priority for us. We want to make sure that they are taken care of. We want to make sure that they have all the resources that they need. We want to make sure that their voices are heard. However, we don't represent victims. We represent Napa County, the people of the state of California. So it happens more often than not that a crime victim might not want to proceed with a case for a lot of reasons, which I'm sure we're going to get to and talk about. But because it is the right and just thing to do, and a crime has been committed, and there are safety issues, safety concerns, and that kind of thing, we, on behalf of the people of the state of California for Napa County, will proceed anyway. And that's whether a victim is on board and wishes to do so or not. We want to do that very gently, very delicately. We want to make sure that they are fully apprised of the process, and we're working with them throughout the entirety of the case. But our duty and our responsibility, while of course it is to honor, respect, and protect the victims and make sure that they're heard throughout the entire process, it is to prosecute crimes that have been committed and to make sure that the community is safe, Napa County is safe, and that the right result is happening with respect to the criminal justice system.
And that really is a priority for the Napa DA's office, is to ensure that the community is safe. And, we will use every avenue available to us to ensure that the community is safe. So can you tell us a little bit, well, can you walk us through how the DA's office handles a case of domestic violence?
Sure. So a crime of domestic violence will occur, and it will somehow get reported to law enforcement, one of the law enforcement agencies in Napa County, whether that's the police department, the sheriff's office, American Canyon PD, any of those. And they will investigate, they will respond, and that's whether a victim calls in a crime. Sometimes there's a third-party witness that sees or hears something. There's any number of ways that these things get reported. The law enforcement agency will investigate. They will collect evidence. They will record body camera. They'll author a report. And if they believe that there's probable cause that a crime has been committed, they will go ahead and forward that case to us at the DA's office. And for Napa County, we are a team of 2 attorneys that handle all the family violence cases vertically. That's a special kind of prosecution model. What that means is we handle the cases from the moment that they come into our office, before they're even cases, when they're just reports from law enforcement, all the way through until the case is concluded. So what happens is I will receive these reports. I'll review the report and then do any number of things. I might review the evidence in the case. I'll look at photographs. I'll listen to 911 calls if they exist. I'll review body camera. Oftentimes at that stage of the proceedings, before a case even becomes a case, before charges are filed, I'll meet with a victim or witnesses to talk to them, to find out more about what occurred and their position, how they're feeling about it, what they would like to see happen, because like I mentioned, although we're not dictated by that, that's something that we always want to take into consideration, and we want to make sure that we're honoring and respecting the victims throughout and making sure that their voices are heard. So we'll often do that. And then based on kind of a complete review of that, we will either file charges, criminal charges, and that's sort of when your classic criminal case starts, or we might send a case back for further investigation, say, hey, we're missing XYZ, or there might not be enough to file charges. We have an ethical duty to only file charges in cases that we believe can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And if we believe that, we will file charges. And they vary. There's lots of different charges that we work with, and they start from misdemeanors and go all the way up to serious and violent felonies. So after we file a case, there's a number of court proceedings. Somebody is arraigned on those charges. The next stage is we have a preliminary hearing. We'll handle it all the way through that. And then if it gets to a jury trial, we'll handle the jury trial, put a case to a Napa jury, all the way to verdict. And that's kind of a general overview of that process.
So Agnes mentioned this. It's the vertical prosecution model that the Napa DA's office uses to prosecute these cases, and that's a big deal, mainly because there's a relationship formed between the parties involved in the case, everyone from our victim advocates to the deputy district attorney to whatever law enforcement was involved in the case, and so that helps the victim if they have any anxieties or any fears of being on the stand, and so on and so forth.
That's absolutely right. And a lot of times, sadly, the criminal justice system is not swift. And so these cases can span years. And I will stay with a case for years, and I will stay with the same victim for years so that they have one trusted prosecutor that they're working with. And generally, like you mentioned, we have a team. We'll have one advocate. There will generally be a lead detective that stays with the case. Usually a district attorney investigator will also be working with us and will stay with the case. So really that case, that victim, that family, if there's a family involved, has one small team that they're working with, because these cases are hard and traumatic enough, and it's a big deal. Somebody has gone through a very traumatic event, and then going through the criminal justice system is traumatic in and of itself. Having to testify in court, often it's people's first times, that kind of thing. So having that dedicated, committed team and having one prosecutor through the case vertically, I think, is incredibly important, specifically for these types of crimes.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, the Monarch Justice Center that we have here in Napa is the one-stop shop for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault that we utilize here in Napa to assist with that process. Now, let's talk a little bit about the myth of a slam dunk case. Here at the Napa DA's office, there's no such thing as a slam dunk case. Every case has its challenges, but since this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, what are some of the challenges and or barriers that you often see in these cases?
Sure. So I think a lot of them involve the nature of the relationship, right? Oftentimes, the crime occurs within a family, within a romantic relationship, whether it's we handle cases that involve dating partners, former dating partners, cohabitants, co-parents, spouses, ex-spouses, really anything that spans the domestic relationship. And so there's a lot of complex feelings, emotions, and ties at play, right?
Right.
People oftentimes, despite the crime, still love each other. Maybe they rely on each other financially, right? Maybe they rely on each other for childcare. Maybe there's complicated family ties. Maybe it's housing.
Or cultural barriers.
Sure,
too.
there's all kinds of things, but really, when you think about domestic violence, there's a lot of hang-ups, for lack of a better word, that people might have, and a lot of legitimate fears or feelings and emotions. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we see with cases involving domestic violence and family violence is that oftentimes victims of these crimes, very quickly after a crime occurs, sort of are reluctant to be involved in the cases. And any number of things can happen, and understandably, and oftentimes justifiably so, right? Because of these complex family relationships, because of these romantic relationships, the feelings, the emotions, the reliances, the ties, people decide that they don't, in fact, want to implicate their significant other or their family member in a crime. They might initially report because they're the victim of some serious or violent crime, or they feel in fear or in trouble at the time, and then they recant, meaning they take it back. And because they don't want to be involved, they say, actually, that didn't happen that way.
Oh, goodness.
They start to self-blame.
Yeah.
It was my fault.
Yeah.
Or it happened some other way altogether. They minimize. Well, it wasn't as bad as what I originally said happened.
Right.
Or they just don't want to be involved in the criminal justice process. They say that they don't want to come to court. They don't want to testify. Really, any number of these things happens. And I would say in my experience, and I've been with the district attorney's office for 14 years now.
Wow.
I would say that in domestic violence cases and family violence cases, one of those types of things, some version of that happens in at least 75% of cases.
Wow, that's quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I can imagine that is probably one of the biggest challenges is that relationship.
And not only with the victim and working with that, but it's also the community perception, right? And with juries, because oftentimes we're having to convince a jury, which is, a panel essentially of community members, that this crime was committed and it's important, and we're here because this happened and we want you to convict, even though a victim might not want that, might be changing their story. Sometimes we'll go to trial without a victim altogether, and there's various kind of complex areas of the evidence code that allow us to work with evidence and different things. But that is a huge challenge with domestic violence and family violence cases, but we find ways to work with that because these are important cases to prosecute. They're important cases for the community, and we want to be keeping these victims safe as well.
Absolutely. And there are resources for people who are in a domestic violence situation. The Monarch Justice Center works with News, who is a local organization that helps victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And there is a 24-hour helpline that you can call, which is 707-255-NEWS. That's 707-255-6397. It's staffed 24 hours, and it's staffed also by trained domestic violence counselors, either in English or in Spanish. So there is help out there. There is help that you can get through the Monarch Justice Center as well. And we will include those in the links of this video so that you guys can peruse those. Let's talk a little bit about the penalties for domestic violence. Are they misdemeanors? Are they felonies? What are your thoughts on that?
So it depends, right? Like I mentioned, when we get a case in, we review it and we decide what types of charges can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And domestic violence really spans the gamut. It can be anything from a misdemeanor, and kind of our most classic misdemeanor domestic violence charge that we see is a domestic violence battery. That's a violation of Penal Code Section 243E1. And when you're on that end of the spectrum, penalties will include probation. And the interesting thing about domestic violence cases is they carry a longer period of probation than sort of your standard misdemeanors. It's a 3-year probationary period. And there's a penal code section that governs what types of probation terms and conditions have to be imposed in a domestic violence case. It's Penal Code Section 1203.097. For example, domestic violence probation will carry a 52-week anger management program. It mandates a protective order of some kind, whether it's a peaceful contact order or a full no contact stay away order. So there's things like that we're going to see with misdemeanor domestic violence probation. And that might include some jail time. It might not initially. It might include work program, that kind of thing. And then you sort of move up the spectrum. And depending on the seriousness of the crime and somebody's criminal history, what types of priors they have, that kind of thing, something could be a felony. Kind of a typical domestic violence felony that we often see is called corporal injury to a domestic partner. That's a violation of Penal Code Section 273.5, subdivision A. And that can carry up to 4 years in prison, depending, again, on somebody's criminal history, how serious that incident was, that kind of thing. And one other important thing to know about domestic violence cases is those cases still, under the right circumstances, and if that is the just result, they still carry real state prison terms, meaning someone will actually go to the California Department of Corrections to serve out that prison term, versus the community might have heard that in a lot of other types of general felony crimes, prison terms, or what used to be prison terms, are now served locally.
Right.
Not the case for domestic and family violence. And then you sort of go up from there. If somebody inflicts great bodily injury during the commission of a domestic violence crime, for example, that can add 3 years in prison on top of whatever the sentence is. If somebody has prior domestic violence, that's something we use to sometimes enhance the penalties and also to prove the cases. So it really runs the gamut.
So it depends on the facts of the case, the circumstances of the
That's
case,
right.
and the history.
Yes.
Excellent. So an interesting statistic that I looked up before we got to recording this podcast. This is a statistic from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and they say that 1 in 3 women and 1 out of 4 men have experienced severe physical harm from their partner. That's staggering to me. I have 2 daughters, and if they were to be put up with another, one of them would have been a victim of severe physical harm from their partner. So, how, anecdotally speaking, of course, because we're not keeping track of numbers during this podcast, at least. What can you tell us about the scope of this problem here in this county?
Sure. Those numbers are not surprising to me at all. I think that domestic violence and family violence is incredibly prevalent. It's prevalent in Napa County and in this community, just as it is anywhere else. It is a problem that really spans all classes, all socioeconomic classes, all cultures, all walks of life. It does not discriminate, unfortunately, and is something that happens, sadly, quite frequently.
Quite frequently, right. Okay, well, yeah, I think that this has been a very insightful podcast, and you have provided to us a lot of great information. Is there anything else that you think our audience would like to know about domestic violence or about your work with the DA's office?
I think it's important for people to know that, again, domestic violence is prevalent. It spans all walks of life. Oftentimes it happens behind closed doors and within a family. But there are resources, as you mentioned, that really, really can help. You mentioned the Monarch Justice Center. I think that is huge because sort of a lot of the resources that a victim in a case like this could need are all in one
place,
space right now. We have mental health services, we have victim advocates, we have law enforcement on site, we have district attorney on site, all of those kinds of things. So I think that it's really less of a traumatic process than maybe it used to be back in the day to get some help or to report a crime, and we are here for you. And we're going to make sure that we honor the victims throughout the process. Something that I often tell people is, even if I disagree with your wishes, I will make sure they are always heard. A victim's always going to have the opportunity to address the court and let the court know what they would like to see happen, how they're feeling, what they want, even if that's something that I disagree with. I'm going to make sure that gets put out there. I think that's important for people to know. We work incredibly closely with Napa Emergency Women's Services. There's housing resources. There's pretty much anything you can think of is out there to help you. And we are also, like I mentioned, because these things span in severity and that kind of thing, we also want to make sure that an offender, a defendant, is getting help and services. And so if there's a chance that that person can be rehabilitated safely back into the family, we want to see that happen. So we really are trying to make sure that the right result happens as far as the criminal justice system is concerned, as far as community safety is concerned, and also that victim and that family. We have all of those priorities in mind, especially because domestic violence is something that happens oftentimes on repeat. There's a cycle of violence and that kind of thing. So we want to make sure that we're doing what we can to break that cycle and serve justice, but also provide help.
Absolutely. Agnes, thank you very much for being a guest on the Sidebar Podcast.
Sure.
And again, if you are a victim of domestic violence, or if you know someone who is a victim of domestic violence, then please do not hesitate to reach out. There are resources. There is emergency housing resources that we provide through our partners over at News. There is a hotline. Again, I'll give you the number. It is 707-255-NEWS. That is 707-255-6397. You can call 24 hours, talk to somebody in English, talk to someone in Spanish. They are there to serve you. And with that, I would like to thank you for joining us on the Sidebar Podcast. We will see you next time. Thank you.